My name is Dr. George Walters-Sleyon, and today I begin a series of conversations, discussions on moral sentiments. It's based on uh, the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. I'll be looking at it today, beginning, I will be going through having a series of conversations about it. Now, whether online, and you can always send me an email. If you're watching through Facebook, you can comment on the conversation. This conversation or these conversations are not about morality, so to speak, but moral sentiments. And part of the questions here that we will be looking at are, what does it mean to be good? Are we taught to be good, or are we born good? What's wrong with society? Does society make us good? And in that light, what happens is that we have a very genuine conversation. So again, it's based on the book Moral Sentiment by Adam Smith. Let's begin the conversation here. Who is Adam Smith? Adam Smith is a Scottish philosopher, born 1723 in Kirkcaldy in Scotland. And he's considered one of the pioneers of the Enlightenment. He attended and taught at Glasgow University and Oxford University as well. But fundamentally, what you come to realize about him was that he was influenced also by his mentor, Francis Hutcheson, who was one of the most important pioneers of the Scottish Enlightenment. Francis Hutcheson believed that people made moral decisions based on what he refers to as a moral sense, that moral judgment was based on sentiment rather than rational capacities. That's very important because part of the questions we'll be looking at today and we'll be looking at in this series has a lot to do with what's happening in our society today in the United States. How do we, as Americans, begin to understand and interpret what's happening around us? And how do we respond? What are the moral capacities, so to speak, that we can engage in so as to talk about a peaceful society, a society that does not entertain or make normative that which becomes problematic to the extent to which we are seeing today. Okay, so Adam Smith, he taught moral philosophy, he taught philosophy, logic, rhetoric, jurisprudence, economics, politics, etc. According to Schneider, who wrote the introduction to the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he describes Adam Smith's life according to the following. He says, 4 intellectual environments shaped the mind of Adam Smith. The University of Glasgow, where he went as a student at the age of 14 in 1739, and where he was a professor from 1749 to 1763. Oxford University, whether he was sent in 1740 by his parents to prepare for orders in the church, and where he apparently spent his 6 years studying instead rhetoric and belles letters, that is beautiful letters as the French, studying pre-revolutionary France, where he visited for the greater part of his 3 years. From 1747 to 1766, in Edinburgh, where he gave public lectures. Adam Smith was appointed to the Board of Customs in 1778 in Edinburgh, and where he spent much of his leisure during the closing years of his life. He died in 1790 in the private company of a distinguished and enlightened circle of Franks and scholars, among them David Hume. If you are into philosophy, the name David Hume means a lot. You begin to think about it. But David Hume was also a Scot, and Adam Smith a Scot, and both of them were Franks as well, okay, during the early period of the Enlightenment era. So these are his works. The Theory of Moral Sentiments happens to be his first major book, published in 1759, and that is what we're going to be discussing throughout this session here, and subsequent sections. And then he wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, which is a very popular book on economics and capitalism. But Adam Smith was not a capitalist, and that's another discussion for another time. But he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which happens to be a very popular book. He wrote lectures on jurisprudence, lectures on rhetoric and bell letters, essays on philosophical subjects, and that covered several areas. But what we're interested in this, starting from today, what we are interested in is the Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith, the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Because part of the goal, again, is to raise questions about who we are, is to raise questions about our society, is to raise questions about appropriate actions and responses. So, the themes that will be discussed in this first discussion today include sympathy as the basis of moral action in chapters 1 and 2. Sympathy as the basis of moral action. Imagination as the basis of sympathy. Thirdly, the concept of fellow feelings and passion. So these are the themes we'll be discussing briefly for this hour, this first discussion. Again, my name is Dr. Walters, George Walters-Sleyon. You can send me an email or visit my website, georgewaltersleyon.com, or just interact through Facebook. The book, the sentiment, the Theory of Moral Sentiment, encompasses a tremendous range of themes, disguised as a work of moral psychology. As a theory of moral sentiment alone, it is also a book about social organization, identity construction. Social organization, identity construction, basically who we are, normative standards, and the science of human behavior as a whole. So it is not a book of theology. It is not a book of theology, neither a book of quote unquote psychology, but it's an interdisciplinary work that looks at, that brings to bear social organizations, disciplines of psychology, sociology, jurisprudence, public policy, politics, economics. It's just a very interdisciplinary work. And the reason I picked this, I love this book, I've been reading it. It gives you a lot of insight into what society is all about and how we can begin to think about where we are as Americans, who we are, and what's going on around us. I think he talks about what is normative. So let's begin this, the first discussion here. The preposition, okay? The preposition that lays down the foundation of this discussion is found in the first chapter, the very first paragraph, okay, the very first paragraph of the book, and I've written it here for you. You can read it along. He says, how selfish soever man may be, man refers, is generic. Let's assume it's generic. It's not referring to just man, okay? So all the quote unquote reference to man here, let us assume that it is referring to, it is neutral, both men and women. He says, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and renders the happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. What is important here is for you to take note. He says, what interests him is the fortune of others. He establishes the preposition here, the foundation, and begins the argument. He says, look, the principles are evident in our action, in our heart, so to speak, that what interests us also is the fortune of others. Okay? And what makes others happy becomes central to us. He said, though he derives nothing in from it except the pleasure of seeing it, of this kind is pity or compassion. This desire to see the good of others, he says, is based on pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others. Okay, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others. When we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. That is, what we see happening around us, the misery of others, okay, that is so real, that is a reality. We have, as human beings, he says, have the propensity, have the tendency to feel a sense of compassion. That we often derive sorrow from the sorrow of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require any instances to prove it. For this sentiment, like the other original passions of human nature, is by no means confined to the virtual or humane. He says the fact that we have this sense of compassion for other people is not because we are good. It's not because we, quote unquote, we are holy or perfect or humane. But basically, it's because we are human. Okay? So fundamentally, what he's saying here is that as human beings, we have this tendency to have compassion, to pity. He said, though they perhaps may feel it with the most exquisite sensibility, in the sense that, yeah, this sense of compassion is felt on a very concrete level. That is, we come to understand the experiences of others based on our own experiences, but then also based on something that is within that makes us want to just identify with the problem, with the misery of other people. He says this, he says, the greatest ruffian, okay, the most hardened person, or the most, someone who may say is so, doesn't display any sense of compassion, etc., the most robust or something person. He said the most hardened violator of the laws of society calls the person a criminal. So it's not altogether without it. You see, the element of pity and compassion, he says, dwells within humanity. He begins that. He says, as human beings, there is a tendency for us to have compassion. So this notion of moral sentiment here that we begin to talk about, again, begins with his argument about pity and compassion. Because he says here, there is this innate response to the misery of other people that sometimes the mind, the brain cannot comprehend. He talks about imagination. Imagination. And I would just like to read this again. So here you begin to see he establishes this notion of pity and compassion. But pity and compassion, to a large extent, he says, are mainly based or informed by a sense of imagination. So what does it mean by imagination? What does it mean by imagination? If we are talking about moral sentiments, if we are talking about moral sentiments as pity and compassion, what does it mean by imagination? He says it is by imagination only that we can form any conception of what are his sensations. That is, the sensations of a man, of a person, or the experience of another person, or the misery of another person. He says it is by imagination only we can form any conception of what are his sensations. That is, the suffering of a person, male or female. He says, neither can that faculty help us to this any other way than by representing to us what would be our own. So basically, the reason why we have compassion, the reason why we exhibit compassion, he says, the reason why we exhibit pity is because we imagine ourselves. We imagine ourselves, okay, being the victim or being ourselves experiencing whatever misery the other person might be going through. Whatever misery the other person might be going through. That's the nature of imagination. You imagine yourself. How can you be compassionate? He says here, you become compassionate in society. You become compassionate when you imagine yourself in the position of the person who is experiencing misery, who is experiencing pain. He says, that's the only, it's not rational for him. For Adam Smith, imagination is the foundation to compassion. Because you think about yourself in the position of the next person who is going through this problem. And it is that imagination and sensibility that makes you want to help the person. He says, it is the impression of our own senses only, not those of his, which our imagination copy. You see, it's not the person's imagination, but I'm imagining myself in the position of this person who is going through who's encountering this pain. He says, by the imagination, we place ourselves in this situation. We conceive ourselves enduring all the same torment. We enter it, as it were, in his body, into his body, and become in some measure the same person with him. Okay? He says, as a result of imagination, we become compassionate. We develop the capacity to have compassion. We develop the capacity to have pity. But in so doing, how we arrive at this point by going within ourselves and seeing ourselves in our body, becoming one with the person who is enduring pain. Because when we enter ourselves through imagination to associate ourselves with the pain of the person, we become one with them. We become one with them. We enter, he says, as it were, into his body and become in some measure the same person. That's how we have compassion and exhibit compassion and express pity to other people. He says, and first form the idea of his sensation. Because that's the only way we cultivate. That's the only way we cultivate this ability to respond to this person's needs. And we can feel something because it is not an isolated, alienated experience that we are having. You see a person in misery, you identify with the person because he says you imagine yourself. with the with this person. And he goes on to give an example, and I will read this. He says that this is the source of fellow feeling as he goes on. He says this: his agonies, when they are thus brought to ourselves, when we have thus adopted and made them our own, begin at last to affect us, and we then tremble and shudder at the thought of what he feels. For as to be in pain or distress of any kind excites the most excessive sorrow, so to conceive or to imagine that we are in it excite some degree of the same emotion, in proportion to the vivacity or dullness of the compassion of the conception. So basically, he's saying here, through imagination, we develop the sensibility to identify with the person in misery. Furthermore, as a means of making moral judgment, imagination and compassion then becomes this means by which we create conditions. We create conditions to mitigate or to reduce the emergence of suffering. Because if suffering abounds, we feel it. You see, if suffering abounds, if there is suffering, we feel it. And that's why we feel this pain. Okay? We feel the pain, the killing of 19 people in Texas. Why? Because to some extent, we imagine ourselves in that situation. That's why we feel the pain of people who have died in Buffalo, New York, or in Tulsa, because we imagine ourselves. Now, the problem becomes if you don't have that sense of imagination, or you stifle that sense of imagination. Because he says it's the element, it's the thing that identifies us with humanity. Furthermore, he talks about fellow feeling or feelings. He said that this is the source of our fellow feeling for the misery of others, compassion, imagination, that it is by changing places in fancy with the sufferer that we come either to conceive or to be affected by what he feels. We change place, or we identify in our minds, in our spirit, in our heart, with the person who is suffering. That, he says, is fellow feeling. How do we then cultivate the sense of fellow feeling? So basically, Adam Smith is saying society thrives on the element of fellow feeling. But if society does not recognize or exhibit fellow feeling, what happens to society? What happens to society? He says the fact that we seek to exhibit fellow feeling with others, with everyone around us, with people around us, is evident. It's not something that is hidden. He says may be demonstrated by many obvious observations if it should not be thought sufficiently evident of itself. So this notion of fellow feeling based on a sense of imagination, okay, imagination thus become that means by which we associate, we identify with the other person suffering, we go within ourselves to develop the element or to develop the sense of compassion, to develop that sense of compassion. But this element of fellow feeling is absolutely important for him. And he gives an example here. He gives an example. He said, when we see a stroke end and just ready to fall upon the leg or arm of another person, We naturally shrink and draw back our own leg or our own arm. And when it does fall, we feel it in some measure and are hurt by it as well as the sufferer. Basically, he's saying, if you see a tree about to fall on someone, you shrink, okay? You naturally just shrink because you know the implication of the falling of the tree on the leg of a person. It might break the leg, they might get amputated, and you know. He says, in that instant, we are identifying with the person. That is fellow feeling. That is fellow feeling. Again, take this example. He says, the mob, when they are gazing at a dancer and a slack rope, naturally raise and twist and balance their own bodies. That is, if you see, quote unquote, if you see people playing football or soccer, their movement, you see other people twisting just like the players on the field. He says that it's that notion of fellow feeling that we exhibit as human beings. He said not to have that becomes problematic. Not to exhibit it. He goes on to say, neither is it those circumstances on which create pain or sorrow that call forth our fellow feeling. Whatever is the passion which arises from any object in a person principally concerned, an analogous emotion springs up at the thought of his situation in the breast of every attentive spectator. He said, our joy of the deliverance of those heroes of tragedy or romance who interest us is sincere. Fellow feelings then becomes that thing that we identify, that leads us to identify with other people. Okay, so if you see a person in an accident and you see the hurt of the person, the injury, you feel something. That's fellow feeling. And he talks about compassion here. So he says, compassion, pity, and compassion are words appropriated to signify our fellow feeling with the sorrow of others. Pity and compassion are words appropriated to signify our fellow feelings with the sorrow of others. Sympathy, though its meaning was perhaps originally the same, may now, however, without much impropriety, be made use of to denote our fellow feeling with any passion whatsoever. What he's saying here is that sympathy then becomes the expression of a fellow feeling. Okay, whether we perceive it as pity or compassion, because fellow feeling becomes fundamental to our relationship. But what happens if society is deprived or if society is depraved of fellow feeling? If society does not or refuses to exhibit a sense of fellow feeling. He talks about violence in this case, violence. What does it mean by violence, and to what extent can this impact fellow feeling? He says, this, however, does not hold universally or with regard to every passion. Just because we have fellow feeling, we exhibit passion, good passions, compassion and sympathy, does not mean we always do that. He says, this, however, does not hold universally or with regard to every passion. There are some passions of which the expressions excite no sort of sympathy. That is, people do something, we do something that does not in any way generate sympathy. Okay, but before we are acquainted with what gave occasion to them, serve rather to disgust and provoke us against them. The furious behavior of an angry man is more likely to exacerbate us against himself than against his enemies. As we are unacquainted with his provocation, we cannot bring his case to home to ourselves, nor conceive anything like the passion which it excites. What he's saying here, when a person commits violence, we automatically do not identify with the person who commits the violence as compared with the person who is affected by the violence. Whether the person be the enemy of the violent person. And to no extent do we then want to bring that kind of, would want to identify with the passion that is exhibited in committing violence or a violent act. He said, no, we do not want to identify with it. Because immediately we choose to identify as humans with the victim of the violence. And in this case, that's why we see, okay, the children that were killed in Tulsa and murders and shooting, we immediately have this human compassion and sympathy to identify with these people, not the one who perpetrated the acts or the ones who perpetrate the acts. We do not want to identify with them. Why? Because the emotions that is immediately generated within us as a result of our imaginations leads us to identify with the people that are suffering. With the people that are suffering. Again, my name is Dr. George Walters-Sleyon, and this is the first of several discussions and series on moral discussion, discussion on moral sentiments based on the works of Adam Smith, his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiment. And this is the first discussion, and you can join us next week. We'll continue this next week, but this is the first of several of the discussions we will be having. So sympathy now, he comes to sympathy. What is sympathy? Sympathy. He says, sympathy, therefore, does not arise so much from the view of the passion as from that of the situation which excites it. Sympathy is not based on passion, but it's based on the situation that passion produces. And in most cases, the pain that passion produces. So in this case, he's making a distinction between passion that is good and passion that is not good. He says, we feel sometimes, or we sometimes feel for another, a passion of which he himself seems to be altogether incapable. Haven't you sometimes felt really, really sorry or sympathy or compassion for someone who is in agony and may not even understand the breadth and depth of their pain, but the person who is looking is in anguish? He said, because that's who we are. Sympathy dwells within us because we immediately begin to imagine when we see a person in pain, what we would be like, or what we would encounter when we find ourselves in such a situation. He says, because when we put ourselves in this case, that passion arises in our breast from the imagination, though it does not in this from the reality. That is, we think about ourselves, we imagine when we see a person suffering. He says, but whatever may be the cause of sympathy, or however it may be excited, nothing pleases us more than to observe in other men as fellow feeling, other men or women of fellow feeling, with all the emotions of our own breast. Nor are we ever so much shocked as by the appearance of the contrary. Basically, he's saying here, sympathy then is that which excites us to generate a sense of fellow feeling and emotions within our breasts. through imagination. We think about it and we put ourselves in that situation. We are shocked by the emotion, the pain, but not the contrary, not the opposite, not that which causes the pain. We do not sympathize with that which causes the pain. That's what he says. We often sympathize with the victims. But what if society does not sympathize? What if the sense of what if society is deprived of sympathy? What do we do? How can society generate a sense of sympathy? And fellow feeling. So again, you've been listening to the first discussion on moral sentiments from the work of Adam Smith. We're looking at the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiment. My name is Dr. George Walters-Sleyon. You're welcome to join us next Saturday again at 8 o'clock to discuss these. We'll be talking about the next chapter. So these are some questions for you to ponder over. How can we exhibit sympathy in our society today? Is our society becoming deprived of sympathy? Because remember, sympathy is not only identity and imagination, it's very active. Sympathy is both passive and active. Because he says, sympathy, he will go on to talk about sympathy as that which motivates us to do what is right, to do what is just. Okay? So when a society is depraved, when a society minimizes, or again, when a society refuses to exhibit sympathy, and then the element of justice, the element of doing what is right is undermined. So what are some of the things that prevent sympathy? One, how can we exhibit sympathy? Two, what are some of the things that prevent sympathy? Are there situations, social conditions, social problems that prevent sympathy, or economic, political, public policy oriented? How can we develop a sense of sympathy in our society today? He said, do we have the imagination to exhibit sympathy? What is our imagination with respect to suffering? How do we make sense of the suffering of other people? Or how do we find ourselves in a position where we perpetuate suffering? For Adam Smith, it's as a result of imagination. If that kind of imagination that leads to fellow feeling is absent or diminished or denied or refuses to be recognized, then the element of sympathy becomes minimized as well. Furthermore, are we declining in sympathy as a means of moral action? Are we declining? Or to what extent can sympathy serve as a means of moral action? To what extent can sympathy serve as a means of moral action? Now, these are things that Adam Smith discusses in his book, okay, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And we will be discussing more of this next week and subsequent weeks. So I invite you to join, and it's on Zoom, every time on Zoom from 8 o'clock in the morning. This video will be posted on my website and will be posted as well, and you can on Facebook, and you can watch it and think about it. But thank you for joining me on Facebook and others that are watching, and your comments are highly, highly appreciated. Again, my name is Dr. George Walters-Sleyon. Send me an email, go to my website, georgewaltersleyon.com, or send me an email through Facebook, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.